Today I want to talk about an interesting topic, at least to me, which is grinders, profiling, the compromises of profiling, as well as how understanding what those compromises are can help you dial in espresso better. So let's start off with profiling and grinders, and I'll use the Niche Zero as an example because I think a lot of people have this grinder, so it's very easy for me to articulate a lot of this. With something like the Niche Zero, it's generally regarded as a very traditional espresso grinder. For me, it makes things taste like chocolate. It's not a very clear coffee grinder, but that doesn't mean you can't make the niche very clear. You could actually make the niche taste like a completely different coffee grinder using the power of profiling. As it turns out, the way we introduce water into the espresso puck can massively change the end result in cup. If I wanted to make a grinder like the Niche Zero taste very clear, all I would have to do is pick a profile that is more clarity optimized. For example, something like a turbo shot. So that's really where this discussion of compromises begins, and I think understanding this is going to be very helpful. So if I turbo shot the Niche Zero, it suddenly becomes like a completely different grinder, becomes much clearer, but I compromise on something. What I compromise on texture, on mouthfeel, on all the things that I actually really like about the Niche Zero, it's gone suddenly because I am now getting a much clearer shot because the grind is much different. The profile is much different. So the way you build flow and you build pressure is suddenly much different than what a traditional style of espresso requires. That traditional style of espresso with this grinder, I get that massive amount of texture, get that great mouthfeel, but I lose all of those nice clarity properties that the turbo shot has. So that's really where I think understanding the range at which your grinder can perform at given a specific profile is very important, because all really what you have to do is pick a profile, pick a style of profile, and understand how your grinder performs in that extreme. So if I go back to this example of a turbo shot and a traditional shot, what I would recommend you do is just take the same coffee, turbo it, see, and go the max turbo you possibly could go, see how clear of a shot you can get, and then taste that compared to a more traditionally dialed in espresso. This would show you what is the clearest your grinder could possibly perform at versus what is normal or what you may be used to. Basically, what is maximum turbo, extreme, clearest, what do I gain, what do I lose, versus what is traditional, what is normal, or really what do you gain and what do you lose compared to the turbo shot. So understanding that range is incredibly helpful when you are dialing in coffees. If I continue with this example, say I use a light roast coffee. Well, if I dial it in traditionally, it probably will taste like chocolate, it probably tastes fine, but it won't be very clear. But because I know how clear this grinder can get, and I can say, hey, wait a second, I think I'm missing a little bit, all I have to do is figure out how far I'm willing to go on the turbo end. So then suddenly I gain the clarity. But I may sacrifice and compromise on the texture. In this example, say you did try out what is the clearest versus what is the most traditional, you would understand what is missing in each style of shot. So what you would have to do is figure out how much you are willing to go on to one side or the other. Maybe you don't actually have to veer so much into one style of profile where you actually compromise on something completely. Maybe you only need to go a little bit into a style of profile where you bring in just enough clarity to satisfy your preferences, but you are willing to sacrifice a little bit of that traditional texture, at least in the example of turbo versus traditional. So I think that's really cool because we're using the same equipment, we're using the same coffee, but it tastes so different, and all we kind of have to do is, without buying a completely separate grinder, is we just figure out where on the range we end up on. Maybe we don't actually have to go full turbo. Maybe we don't have to be in traditional. Maybe there's a good compromise in between that will work well for your tastes. And that's something that I think is really worth exploring and keeping in mind when you are dialing in a new coffee, is try the same coffee on an extreme with a profile that you want to explore, say something like a turbo shot, and then try it on a traditional profile. Then figure out what's missing in each of those shots, and then gradually bring them together and find out what you really like. Fortunately, there's no silver bullet to all of this. It really depends on what equipment you have, what grinder you're using. Does your machine even have the ability to profile? Like, this won't necessarily solve all of your problems, but this will help you get a little bit closer to what you may actually prefer in cup with a given coffee. There are other things worth mentioning. You might actually just be limited based on your grinder. The grinder is very important in all of this, and it is helpful to have profiling, but sometimes profiling can't save a grinder. Profiling is not a be it and end all solve. While profiling can do all these different amazing properties to a coffee grinder and the end result in cup, if you don't have a good coffee grinder, then profiling might not be the solution. You might actually just be limited based on your hardware. So I kind of want you to understand that. Another interesting thing that I want to mention is actually more expensive grinders. This is something worth talking about because with more expensive grinders, you actually compromise less. There is a much larger sweet spot with these grinders, and what is very fascinating with all of this to me right now is that in this exact comparison here, I can make the niche zero be pretty clear, actually, like really clear if I really try using profiling. But if I do a very traditional style shot on something like this Kafatek MC4, it is already just as clear, if not clearer, and I don't compromise anywhere on the texture. I get the massive clarity, I get the texture, and I don't lose out on the texture like I do here. Now, what's interesting to also note is, well, then I can just turbo this grinder. Then I can get to an even clearer result than this will ever possibly get. But that's something worth thinking about, and it kind of makes sense because if you spend a lot of money on coffee grinders, your experience should lack compromises. Although there are definitely are compromises with these expensive grinders, at least in the experience, the workflow. So I hope that was really interesting to you all. Profiling is something that can bring out many different properties of your coffee grinder, but I would argue that it's not a be it or end all solve. Rather, it's a tool to help you adjust your one, expectations, and two, the properties in cup to be closer to what you may be looking for, and understanding what the ranges at which your coffee grinder can perform under various profiles is very helpful when you're dialing in coffee, because maybe you actually don't have to spend more money on equipment. All you might actually have to do is adjust the profile you're using, and doing that might actually help you understand your coffee grinder a little bit better. Might also help you set your expectations a bit better when you are using a certain coffee bean. I think this will all help you dial in your espresso better, and you will have a much better experience. But that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for spending the time to watch the video. I'll see you around.